Hello, and welcome to the Watcher's review of The Caves of Androzani, a story that served as the final bow for the Fifth Doctor, a directorial debut, a return of absence of one of the series' most celebrated writers, and a whole host of great characters. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted for more content. So, let's run through the story. Be aware, as ever, there are spoilers abound. The Doctor and Peri land on the planet Androzani Minor, and as a result of mistaken identity, immediately get caught up in a small war taking place on the planet over control of a substance called spectrox, which supposedly holds back the aging process. At the same time, both of them also contract the deadly spectrox toxemia, which has only one known cure. So in the midst of dodging a war, execution, and getting taken prisoner, the Doctor is in a race against time to find the cure, and for him and Peri to escape the carnage. This is a story rich in characters, which is typical of the writer Robert Holmes and is prevalent in a lot of his other Doctor Who stories. First of all, you have the Doctor and Peri, who are just in their second adventure, following on from the previous story, Planet of Fire, and from the opening moments, there isn't quite the bond that usually develops between the Doctor and his companion, and in the opening scenes he actually seems irritated by her sarcastic remarks. This changes when the Doctor becomes laden with guilt when both are looking potential death in the face. From there, the true character of the Doctor shines through in that he is driven to find a cure primarily for Peri, as his curiosity got them both into the predicament that they fall in. He has no care for the other characters or the war that they are fighting, and simply wants to get him and his friend out of the scenario. The Doctor in this story finds himself largely redundant and resigned on ideas to get out of their scenario. Evident that even within the first 5 minutes of them being captured, his only suggestion to Peri as to what they do next is surrender. He also seems devoid of ideas when they face execution in the first episode, and only get out of it by Sharaz Jek's intervention. This is a Doctor that is vulnerable, without gadgets, and left merely with his wits and intelligence. There are 2 real moments, however, when the Doctor does use his ingenuity to get out of a situation. Firstly, to bypass Sharaz Jek's android, who reacts to recognising just human anatomy, and second, to free himself from his chains to reroute the Gunrunner's ship back to Androzani Minor when it was originally heading to its twin planet. Despite the vulnerability, though, of the Doctor, we instead see a pure form of his heroic side and his willingness to sacrifice himself to save others. In turn, this is a story that could only have been written for the Fifth Doctor in the classic series, given his vulnerable character, and in turn, Peter Davison gives arguably his finest performance as the Doctor. Peri, on the other hand, isn't really given much to do in this story, other than portraying the Doctor's friend who is either dying or captured. But that is fine. After all, she is the focal point of the story, in that the Doctor needs to save her life rather than the planet or the universe. Therefore, she has to be defenceless or helpless to gravitate the importance of the fact that she, as well as the Doctor, is dying. Nicola Bryant does her best as the helpless companion with a difference here, and apart from at the start where she accidentally loses her faux American accent and briefly reverts to her natural English accent to say the word glass, she does the job really well, given that it is only her second story, but her last with the Fifth Doctor, and that her relationship with the Sixth Doctor is overall different and reverts to the frosty, annoyed relationship she has with the Fifth Doctor in the first half of the first episode in the story. The other key characters I'd like to talk about are the 2 main antagonists, Morgus and Sharaz Jek. Morgus is a greedy, power-obsessed chairman of the Sirius conglomerate, who literally lacks a conscience and will go to any lengths to sustain power, control, and wealth via the spectrox. But at the same time, he is immensely paranoid, and through ill-judged decisions based on his paranoia, sets off a chain reaction of events that unravel as the story progresses, taking on board a lot of casualties. He spends a lot of the story in his office on Androzani Major, divulging in political scheming while simultaneously giving out orders and orchestrating what is happening on Androzani Minor. John Normanton hams up his role delightfully in this story, which isn't surprising given his theatrical background. He portrays Morgus in an entirely unique way by turning away and breaking away the fourth wall in order for the viewer to know his personal thoughts and highlighting his paranoia and ill-judged assumptions. This feels almost Shakespearean and actually came about by mistake due to the actor's misunderstanding of the stage direction he was given. However, director Graham Harper decided to keep them in due to their effectiveness, and I have to say it is absolutely the right decision to make, and in the wrong hands it could look ridiculous. However, I think shared credit to John Normanton's performance, Graham Harper's directing, and Robert Holmes' writing in this case. John Normanton would go on to appear in Doctor Who again 4 years later in The Happiness Patrol, to a lesser effect as he is as Morgus, as well as appearing in the Torchwood episode Ghost Machine in 2006, which turned out to be one of his last acting roles before he passed away in 2007. You then have Sharaz Jek, the Phantom of the Opera-styled scientist come outlaw and hoarder of the Spectrox on Androzani Minor, who conceals his disfigured appearance and hides out in the depths of the caves with his army of androids. His superior intellect to all the other characters, with the exception of the Doctor, allows him to stay one step ahead of Morgus, the gunrunners, and the army. Someone who likes to boast his greater intelligence and logic, but unlike Morgus, isn't motivated by power so much, but more getting revenge on him, having been double-crossed and left to die when they were business partners, which left him disfigured and mad. At this point you would sympathise for him somewhat until you remember his mission of vengeance has cost a lot of lives in the army's fight with his androids, and then his pervy fascination with Peri, who he is willing to keep her prisoner just to meet his own obsession with her beauty to satisfy his own needs to the point of not even caring about the Doctor. Given his appearance, you can understand why Sharaz Jek is portrayed as the main villain, but in my opinion, Morgus is more the primary antagonist, and Sharaz Jek is more of a tragic figure driven mad on vengeance. However, they are both antagonists, given that the story is driven by their personal feud, and I can understand that Sharaz Jek is given top billing, given his appearance, which makes him more sellable to the viewers as a villain compared to Morgus, who outwardly is just human. The character is played here by Christopher Gable, who started life as a ballet dancer and choreographer before venturing into acting. This is interesting since his means of performance has to generally be delivered by his method of dialogue delivery, due to the fact his character wears a mask, and even in the brief moment he is unmasked, the actor is under makeup to show Sharaz Jek's disfigured face. But you feel here that Christopher Gable saw this role as something different and an opportunity to show off his acting skills, other than, I dare say, what physical aspects that he could have shown in another role. David Bowie was actually originally considered for the role, but was unavailable. However, it is hard to see him or the production team missing the opportunity to have someone of his stature hide behind makeup and masks, so it is probably a good thing using lesser-known actor Christopher Gable instead. Other characters that feature are General Chelek, in charge of the army, Salentine, his right-hand man, Stott, who is the leader of the gunrunners, and his right-hand man Krolper, the president of Androzani Major, who has doubts over Morgus, and Timin, who is Morgus's seemingly loyal PA with her own agenda. I could spend time going into depth about all these characters, but we would be here all day. But this, again, is testimony to Robert Holmes in that even minor characters have depth and importance. This story marked a return of one of the classic series' most celebrated writers and former script editor, Robert Holmes. Before this story, his last contribution was 6 years earlier with 1978's The Power of Kroll, which featured Tom Baker and admittedly wasn't one of his best efforts. Robert Holmes has a tendency to produce memorable characters in his stories either through their larger-than-life personas or being memorable as a villain, even if they are villains by the circumstance rather than the choice, and Caves of Androzani is no exception. There are no monster characters in this story per se, in comparison to Daleks or Cybermen, but there are plenty of monstrous and larger-than-life characters, in particular with Morgus and Sharaz Jek. This brings more believable context to the narrative, even in a science fiction setting, allowing the story to resonate more with the audience. Robert Holmes also had a tendency to drop in real-life themes into his stories. In The Caves of Androzani, he revisits a plot element used in The Power of Kroll around the idea of gunrunners playing sides off each other. In this story, he also explores the themes of the morality of war, drugs in the form of spectrox, consumerism and the lengths corporations go to make something available for its customer, as well as the 7 deadly sins. As previously mentioned, all the guest characters in this story are not very likeable, and as such there is a representation of each of the 7 deadly sins between them. You have lust, represented by Sharaz Jek's instant fascination with Peri, which also manifests into envy when he longs to have fair skin and beauty like her. Then you have greed, represented primarily by Morgus and him going to great lengths to keep a retail monopoly on the spectrox, as well as a small subplot in closing down mines, forcing his staff into unemployment, only for them to be sent to labour camps owned by his company and having his former employers working for him again, only for free. You could also add Stots to this category too. In regards to gluttony, you have the unseen population of Androzani Major, represented by the President, and their demand and dependency for spectrox. Wrath, given by Sharaz Jek's motivation of getting revenge on Morgus from when he was double-crossed during their time as business partners. Pride is written all over General Chelak, who will go to great lengths to hide any of his weaknesses, given that Sharaz Jek and his androids are basically running rings around his army. Sloth was the hardest one to summarise, but then you could apply this to all of the guest characters, when a definition of sloth being to show a lack of care, and that across the story, a lot of the characters show a lack of care towards people's lives merely to profit out of the deceased's downfall. In short, Robert Holmes portrays a lot of adult themes in what the BBC consider at the time a children's TV programme, and you have to hope in some ways that a lot of these themes went over the heads of the younger audience who may not actually have understood what was going on. I suppose it serves justice to Robert Holmes' writing skills that I've got this far without even talking about the Regeneration. The scene was actually written by script editor Eric Saywood and is perhaps the most interesting of all the Regeneration sequences in the show's history. Before the Regeneration, we have the Doctor going full-on Shakespearean and asking himself, is this death? As this time he is unsure if a regeneration is going to happen. He even confirms this to Peri before admitting that it feels different this time, before falling unconscious. This part you feel acts somewhat as a foreshadow of the upcoming 6th Doctor's persona, which can be said is polar opposite from the 5th's. Nevertheless, it is an interesting approach to a regeneration sequence. The sequence itself carries a lot of similarities with the previous regeneration story, Logopolis, where the 4th Doctor transitioned into the 5th, only this time you could say that the production team upped the ante. In Logopolis, you got flashback stock footage of the companions and villains. However, this regeneration sequence actually used special recording sequences of all the companions that served with the 5th Doctor. Tegan, Nyssa, Turlo, Chameleon, and last but not least, Adric, which prompts the 5th Doctor's last words as Adric, and being reminded of his death back in Earthshock before being overwhelmed with an image of the Master telling the Doctor to die before the regeneration occurs. It has been argued that the re-emergence of Adric causes the regeneration to falter, which explains the 6th Doctor's character. Speaking of the 6th Doctor, we are finally presented with him at the end of the sequence, and for the first time, a new Doctor has some lines to say before the end of the story. Something that we are used to now, but something of a novelty back in the 1980s. To top it off, where fans would have to wait 12 months in some circumstances for the debut of a new Doctor, this time they only had to wait a week, as the 6th Doctor's debut story, The Twin Dilemma, aired straight after. It's only a shame that the 6th Doctor's debut is nowhere near the quality of the 5th Doctor's swansong. The Caves of Androzani marked the debut of director Graham Harper, someone who has worked his way up through the ranks through the 1970s, starting with 1971's Colony in Space. From the start you can see that he is a director with a difference by incorporating alternative ideas such as the use of freehand camera work and the use of slow motion, as well as choosing to direct from the floor rather than the control roof. The use of lighting is cleverly used and disguises the limited budget by creating dimly lit sets where it is primarily the actors and not the background that is well lit, which also adds to the atmosphere of the story. A prime example of this is the use and appearance of the magma creature, a so-called terrifying creature that roams the caves devouring anything that comes across it. However, on appearance it is rather unconvincing and thankfully is used sparingly and isn't overly lit. From what is visible of the sets, you can see that the designs are largely basic. John Hurst does his best with what he has, but the caves are largely made of fake rock-looking walls and a flat studio floor together with scaffolding. General Chalak's headquarters is basically a building site cabin, and background cityscapes of Androzani Major are very 80s with vibrant colours, which is in stark contrast to the cave sets. The strength of the story, though, lets you see beyond this, which in this era of Doctor Who is important, as there wasn't a lot of style to cover up any lack of substance, something that when you watch lesser remembered shows from the same era is clearly obvious compared to what we are used to seeing nowadays. Overall, the mood is bleak and atmospheric for the scene set in Androzani Minor, which is coupled with Roger Lim's minimalist incidental music consisting of drum rhythms and synthesized howling. In comparison, the scene set in Androzani Major, filled with vibrant colours, are coupled with a more upbeat but still minimalist music. Costumes as a whole are very 1980s looking, and Chalak's army look like Crystal Maze contestants wearing hard hats. However, Andrew Rose pushes the boat out with Sharaz Jek's costume with a leather bondage look coupled with African tribal designs. Caves of Androzani was originally broadcasted between the 8th and 16th of March 1984 in 4 25-minute episodes and fitted in as the penultimate story of season 21, which is interesting given that it was the first time since William Hartnell that a Regeneration story didn't act as the closing story to a season. In my opinion, this is a masterpiece in Doctor Who storytelling and is a highlight of 1980s era of the show, and is a rare example of storytelling, production, acting and character development coming together in high quality without any padding to the story development. Even with the limitations of some of the set designs and the underwhelming magma creature, you are able to see through this very quickly as you immerse yourself into the story. It often shows up in polls as one of the greatest stories, and Peter Davison called it his favourite and admitted he might have carried it on for longer as the Doctor if more of the stories were done like Caves of Androzani. Producer John Nathan Turner and actress Nicola Bryant have also called it a highlight of their time on the show. I first saw this story when I was about 8 or 9 when I bought it on VHS, and have to admit I found it a bit boring, but the older I got, the more and more I appreciated it, to the point where I consider it one of my own personal favourites. I put this down to the fact that I now understand and appreciate the adult themes more than I did when I was younger. It's because of this I would say that it's not the best story for younger kids to see. The content is far more mature, and even some of the visual content, such as the appearance of Sharaz Jek and some of the violent scenes, could come across as intimidating. As much as I love Caves of Androzani, I wouldn't suggest it as a story to get acquainted with the Fifth Doctor. The Fifth Doctor is a character full of vulnerability and guilt, especially in regards to the death of Adric back in his first season, and as such, this Doctor evolves over the course of Peter Davidson's 3 seasons in a row, and as such, Caves of Androzani serves perfectly as the story to conclude his character, as any Regeneration story should. The whole story is designed and written to be a finale for this incarnation of the Doctor, but it isn't the main plot driver, as other Regeneration stories are. Rather than being about the Doctor, it's about saving Peri, a companion who the Doctor is still getting to know and still isn't at ease with, but is willing to put his own life on the line to save hers, and that is what the Doctor is all about, saving others that he hardly knows, even if it does mean putting his own life on the line. As strong as this story is, it could also only work as a Regeneration story, as the tension builds up over the course of the 4 episodes, where you know that the Doctor will find a way to get out of the situation, but as he becomes more and more desperate, you realise that the ultimate sacrifice has to be made. Had the story ended with both the Doctor and Peri both being cured, then it would have been an unusual, overtly upbeat ending that would have gone against the grain of the mood and atmosphere of the story in general. In the end, you do obviously get the upbeat ending as Peri is cured and the Doctor regenerates, but it is a sweeter and more gratifying triumph as it came at a cost, the demise of the Fifth Doctor. So, that concludes my review on the Caves of Androzani. Of course, it is only my opinion, so feel free to express your own in the comments if you think differently to my review. Be sure to tune in for my next review, but if you do have a suggestion for a story for me to review, then just let me know. But remember, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.